The sun over the New Mexico territory was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth until the very air shimmered with a heat that stole the breath. For 2 days, that hammer had been beating on Ruth. It had baked the dust into the torn hem of her calico dress, cracked her lips, and bleached the hope from her eyes, leaving only a raw, red-rimmed exhaustion. She was 18, but in the merciless glare of that sun, she felt as old and worn as the landscape itself. She had run from a clapboard house that had ceased to be a home, from a father whose watery eyes held no love, only the cold calculation of a gambler settling a debt. The man he had promised her to was not a husband, but a buyer, his hands thick and his smile thin, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco. The word marriage had been a flimsy curtain drawn over a transaction of flesh and future. So she had run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, heavy necklace tucked deep into her bodice, its metal cool against her frantic heartbeat. The train was a mirage at first, a black serpent slithering along the horizon. When it finally groaned into the dusty outpost that passed for a station, it was not a vessel of hope but of desperation. Passenger cars were out of the question. She had no coin, and her appearance would have seen her thrown off before she even set foot on the steps. It was the freight cars, or nothing. She slipped between 2 buildings, her movements furtive and small, like a desert mouse avoiding the shadow of a hawk. The freight car door was already ajar, a dark, gaping mouth. The air that wafted out was thick with the smells of sweat, old hay, and something acrid, like cheap whiskey. A few other souls were huddled inside, men with grim faces and women with slumped shoulders, all seeking passage without a ticket. They were ghosts, fading into the shadows, and she meant to be one of them. Hoisting herself up was a struggle. Her arms ached, her muscles screaming in protest. A splinter drove deep into her palm, but she barely registered the pain. She tumbled inside, landing on a pile of dusty burlap sacks, the impact jarring her to the bone. For a moment, she just lay there, the darkness of the car a blessed relief from the sun's assault. The train gave a violent lurch, the shriek of metal on metal a promise of movement, of distance. They were leaving. She was leaving. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she took stock of her fellow travelers. They were a scattered collection of the lost and the broke, each occupying their own small island of misery. They glanced at her, a quick, dismissive assessment, and then looked away. A girl in a torn dress with wild hair and haunted eyes was just another piece of the scenery. She was no one, except to one man. He sat at the far end of the car, away from everyone else, as if a circle of profound and unnerving silence radiated from him. He was immense, not just tall, but broad, a mountain of a man who seemed to take up more space than he was physically occupying. He wore a long, dusty duster that had seen more miles than a stagecoach mule, and a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face completely. His hands, resting on his knees, were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. He was perfectly still, a statue carved from rock and patience. The other passengers gave him a wide berth. They did not just avoid sitting near him, they actively angled their bodies away, their low murmurs ceasing whenever his head shifted even a fraction of an inch. He was not a part of their miserable community. He was something else entirely, an apex predator resting in the shade, and they were all wise enough to know it. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to find the opposite corner, to make herself as small and invisible as possible. The men her father gambled with, the man she was supposed to marry, they were cruel, but they were a familiar kind of cruel. This man was an unknown territory, as vast and dangerous as the desert itself. But then, a chilling thought cut through her exhaustion. The men hunting her would be looking for a lone girl, a frightened rabbit hiding in a corner. They would not think to look for her beside the wolf. In a world where weakness was an invitation for attack, The most dangerous place might just be the safest. Her body moved before her mind had fully committed. She rose on trembling legs, ignoring the sharp pain in her palm. The floorboards groaned under her light weight. Every eye in the car followed her as she walked the length of the shuddering train. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. The low hum of conversation died completely, replaced by the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels on the rails. She could feel their stares like physical things, branding her a fool. She stopped before him. He did not look up. The shadow from his hat concealed everything but a square jaw covered in dark stubble and a mouth set in a firm, unreadable line. She could smell the dust on his coat, and beneath it, the faint, clean scent of sagebrush and leather. He did not move a muscle, yet his stillness was more intimidating than any threat. She had one card to play. It was a desperate, foolish thing, a truth that could either be her shield or her final undoing. Her throat was a desert, her voice a mere scratch of sound when it finally came out. She leaned down slightly, so the words were for him alone, a secret shared in the rattling darkness. "I'm the virgin they warned you about." It was not a seduction. It was a confession and a plea. It meant, I am trouble. I am unclaimed property. I bring with me the kind of danger that gets men killed. I am the thing good men are told to avoid, and bad men are told to possess. Now you know. Do with it what you will. The silence that followed was absolute. The clatter of the train seemed to fade into the background. She watched the unmoving line of his mouth, waiting for the sneer, the dismissal, the rough hand that would shove her away. She waited for him to call her out, to expose her to the other passengers, to throw her to the wolves that were surely on her trail. The giant in the dusty coat did none of those things. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand. He did not touch her. Instead, his fingers went to the brim of his hat, and he tipped it. It was a gesture so small, so simple, yet it held a universe of meaning. It was an acknowledgement. I hear you. Then, with the same unhurried motion, he shifted his body. He took the edge of his heavy duster, the fabric thick and coarse, and lifted it. He created a small, dark space beside him, an invitation into the shield of his own formidable shadow. He did not speak. His eyes, still hidden, offered no promises, no reassurances. The gesture was plain, practical. It was shelter, nothing more, nothing less. A sob caught in Ruth's throat, a sound of such profound relief it was almost painful. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the space he had made, huddling against his side like a chick seeking the warmth of a hen. The heavy canvas of the duster fell over her, cloaking her in darkness and the scent of leather and dust. The outside world, the staring eyes of the other passengers, the hammering sun, it all disappeared. She was hidden. She pressed her cheek against the rough wool of his shirt. Beneath it, she could feel the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. His body was a furnace, radiating a steady heat that began to chase the chill of fear from her bones. She could feel the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing, a calm and steady tempo in the chaotic rattle of the train. He was a stranger. She did not know his name, the color of his eyes, or the nature of the silence he carried with him. He could be a killer, a thief, a man running from something far worse than she was. But in that moment, pressed against his side, shrouded by his coat, he was the only anchor she had in a world that had come completely undone. She began to shake, the tremors starting in her hands and spreading through her entire body, a delayed reaction to days of terror and flight. She clenched her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering, but it was no use. The man beside her seemed to feel it. The arm resting on his knee moved, and for a terrifying second she thought he was going to push her away. Instead, his large hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. He did not squeeze. He did not pull her closer. His hand simply lay there, its weight a silent, steadying pressure. It was not a gesture of comfort, not in the way a softer man might offer it. It was a gesture of fact. You are here. I am here. Be still. And slowly, miraculously, she was. The trembling subsided, replaced by a weariness so profound it felt as though her bones were turning to lead, under the cloak of a nameless, silent man, on a freight train to nowhere. Ruth finally let her eyes drift shut, her body surrendering to the pull of an exhausted sleep. Sleep did not come to Ruth as a peaceful blanket, but as a series of ragged, shallow dives into darkness. She would drift for a few moments, her body limp against the unyielding warmth of the man beside her, only to be jerked back to consciousness by the ghost of a memory, the clammy touch of her intended's hand, the dead-eyed stare of her father across a card table, the endless sun-bleached horizon of a future she had refused to accept. Each time she woke, the first sensation was the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels, a sound that was both a lullaby and a warning drum, carrying her further away from one danger and deeper into an unknown one. The man, Jed, remained a statue of silent presence. He had not shifted, had not spoken a word since his single, world-altering gesture. His hand still rested on her shoulder, a weight that was no longer just steadying but had become a strange kind of anchor. In the darkness of the freight car, surrounded by the soft snores and murmurs of the other passengers, she was acutely aware of him. She could feel the slow, powerful beat of his heart through his thick shirt, a rhythm as constant and reliable as the turning of the earth. He was a mystery, a wall of a man who had absorbed her desperate confession without question, and in doing so, had become the sole guardian of her fragile freedom. As the hours bled into one another, the slivers of light piercing through the cracks in the wooden walls of the car turned from fiery orange to a deep, bruised purple, and finally, to the silver blue of moonlight. The air grew cooler, carrying the chill of the high desert night. A deep shudder ran through the train, a long, mournful screech of metal grinding against metal, and their forward momentum began to slow. Ruth's eyes snapped open, every nerve ending suddenly alive. The change in rhythm was a disturbance, a break in the spell of flight. The other passengers began to stir, their shadowy forms sitting up, their voices low and questioning. Through a wide gap between two planks, she could see the flickering lights of a small settlement. It wasn't a town. Not really. It was a place that existed only because the railroad needed it to a towering wooden water tank, a dark mound of coal, and a single, long building with yellow lamplight spilling from its grimy windows, a saloon, and likely nothing more. The train hissed and groaned, steam billowing past the open door like a departing spirit, before lurching to a final, jarring halt. Jed did not move, but she felt a subtle shift in the muscles of his back, a tension that hadn't been there before. He was listening. The air outside was suddenly filled with new sounds, the tired panting of the locomotive, the distant, tinny plink of a piano from the saloon, and the murmur of men's voices. Then, another sound joined the chorus, one that made the blood in Ruth's veins turn to ice. Hoofbeats. Not the slow, plodding gait of a farmer's mule, but the confident, rhythmic drumming of several horses being ridden with purpose. She instinctively pressed herself deeper into his side, pulling the heavy duster more tightly around her. She tried to make herself smaller, to dissolve into the shadows, to cease to exist. The horses drew closer, stopping near their end of the train. There was the creak of leather as men dismounted, the jingle of spurs on the hard-packed dirt. And then a voice cut through the night, a raw, grating sound that seemed to scrape the silence into pieces. "We're looking for a runaway girl by the name of Ruth Miller." Ruth's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. It was him, not her father, not the man she was sold to, but his right hand, a cruel, whip-thin man named Silas, whose job was to handle his master's dirty work. The name, her name, echoed in the vast, empty night, a summons from a life she was desperately trying to outrun. Another voice, younger and rougher, chimed in. Her PA wants her back. Got a reward for anyone who's seen her." A few of the passengers in the car stirred with interest, their heads turning toward the open door. A reward. That single word transformed her from a piece of pitiful scenery into a commodity. She could feel their eyes on her now, even in the darkness, the weight of their speculation. "Last seen heading for the rail line." Silas's voice continued, closer now. 18 years old, brown hair, wearing a blue calico dress. She ain't got nowhere to go." His footsteps crunched on the gravel just outside. Ruth could picture him perfectly, his narrow, weasel-like face, the perpetual sneer on his thin lips. He was the kind of man who enjoyed the fear of others. He would not be merciful. Suddenly, the world in front of her was blotted out. Jed Knox moved. It was not a fast or panicked motion. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding, like a bear rising to its full height. He stood up in the cramped space, his head nearly brushing the ceiling of the car. His broad back was a solid wall of darkness, completely shielding her from the opening and the searching eyes outside. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't asked who she was, why they were calling her name, or what trouble she had brought to his doorstep. He had simply heard the threat and placed himself in front of it. From her place on the floor, huddled in the folds of his discarded duster, the world shrank to the space he defined. She could see nothing but the worn leather of his gun belt, the heavy handle of the Colt holstered at his hip, and the vast expanse of his back. He was a fortress, and she was the last citizen hiding within its walls. A lantern was lifted, and a brilliant yellow light flooded the entrance to the car. It cast Jed's shadow long and deep, a giant silhouette that fell over Ruth and the cowering passengers behind her. "Anyone in there?" Silas barked. His shadow appeared in the doorway, thin and distorted by the light. No one answered. The silence was thick with fear and greed. "We know folks sneak passage on these things," Silas said, his voice taking on a wheedling, almost friendly tone that was far more menacing than his shouting. "Just tell us if you've seen the girl. The reward is good coin." A man near the front of the car, a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks, cleared his throat. "Ain't seen no one like that, mister." His voice was weak, trembling. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Well, we're gonna have a look for ourselves." He started to heave himself up into the car, followed by another, bulkier man. Jed stood his ground, a silent, immovable obstacle. "Step aside, friend," Silas said, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He couldn't see past Jed's immense frame. "This ain't your business." Jed didn't speak. He didn't even turn his head. He simply remained, a sentinel of defiance. The third man, the younger one, stayed on the ground, holding the lantern high. He squinted, trying to pierce the shadows behind the big man. "Wait a minute. Silas," he said, his voice sharp with discovery. "Look there, on the floor, by his boots. Is that a piece of blue cloth?" Time stopped. Ruth looked down. A corner of her torn calico dress was visible, peeking out from beneath the heavy duster, a tiny flag of betrayal in the lantern light. Silas's sneer was audible in his voice. "Well, well, what do we have here? It seems your business just became our business. Friend. Now, you can move aside easy, or we can move you." Jed still didn't move, but Ruth felt, rather than saw, his whole body coil. The stillness was no longer patient. It was predatory. The air crackled with the promise of violence. She saw his right hand shift, his fingers hovering just over the butt of his pistol. But then, the train gave a sudden, violent jolt. A loud hiss of steam erupted from the engine, a signal that their stop was over. The wheels groaned, then began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Silas cursed. "They're moving, grab her!" The man already in the car lunged, not at Jed, but around him, trying to get to Ruth. Jed moved with a speed that was shocking for a man his size. He didn't draw his gun. He simply swatted the man away with a backhanded blow from his forearm. It wasn't a punch. It was a dismissal, like clearing a fly from the air. The man stumbled backward with a grunt, crashing into Silas. It bought them a second, no more. Jed bent down in one fluid motion, his powerful hand closing around Ruth's arm. His grip was like iron, not painful, but absolute. He pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. His face was finally level with hers, and in the flickering lantern light, she saw his eyes for the first time. They were not cruel, nor were they kind. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they held a calm, terrifying clarity. He was not afraid. "Jump," he said. His voice was a low rumble, not a suggestion, but a command that expected total obedience. The train was picking up speed now, the clatter of the wheels becoming a steady rhythm. The open doorway was a moving frame of dark, scrub-dotted landscape. Jumping meant leaping into a black, unknown world, onto hard, uneven ground. It meant broken bones, or worse. But staying meant Silas. Shouts erupted from the doorway. "Don't let them get away!" Jed didn't wait for her to decide. He held her tight against his side, took 2 long strides toward the opening, and without a moment's hesitation, he leaped, pulling her with him into the abyss of the night. The fall felt like it lasted forever. There was a dizzying sensation of weightlessness, the rush of cold air, the ground hurtling up to meet them. They hit with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. It was not a clean landing. They tumbled, a chaotic mess of limbs and fabric, down a short, gravelly embankment. Rocks and coarse sand scraped at her skin, tearing at her dress and her hands. Jed's large body absorbed most of the impact, his arms instinctively wrapping around her to shield her head. They came to a stop in a tangle at the bottom of the slope. For a moment, all Ruth could hear was the ringing in her ears and her own ragged, painful gasps for air. A gunshot cracked in the distance, the bullet whining harmlessly over their heads. A final, angry punctuation mark to their escape. Jed was already moving. He pushed himself up, pulling her with him. "Run!" he grunted, his voice strained. He was limping slightly, but his grip on her hand was firm. They scrambled away from the tracks, plunging deeper into the darkness. The desert night swallowed them whole. The train, with its shouting men and its single point of light, continued on its journey, shrinking until it was just a faint glow. And then nothing. The sounds of the engine and the rails faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the mesquite and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. They were alone, fugitives in an immense, silent, and unforgiving land, with nothing but the stars above and the shared desperation that bound them. The desert at night was a different beast. The crushing weight of the sun was replaced by the vast, crushing emptiness of the dark. The sky was not black but a deep, velvet indigo, punched through with a million cold, glittering stars. They were not the soft, friendly stars of a town. They were sharp, indifferent, and impossibly far away. They offered no warmth, only a faint, ghostly light that turned the landscape into a treacherous world of silver and shadow. Jed did not run aimlessly. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride, his limp from the fall a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the hurried scuffle of Ruth's worn-out shoes. He held her hand, not in a gesture of comfort, but of utility. His grip was a tether, pulling her along in his wake, guiding her over loose rock and around the thorny clutches of mesquite bushes that seemed to reach for her like skeletal hands. Ruth's body was a symphony of pain. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath, the scrapes on her hands and knees, forgotten in the adrenaline of the escape, now throbbed with a fiery intensity. Every muscle screamed for rest, but she did not falter. To stop, to fall behind, was to be left to the mercy of Silas and his men, and she knew they had none. So she matched his pace, her eyes fixed on the dark, broad shape of his back, trusting him with the blind faith of the truly desperate. He was her compass, her shield, her entire world in that moment. He led them away from the flatlands and into a series of low, broken hills, the ancient, eroded bones of the earth. The ground became more difficult, a jumble of rock and sand. He was not searching. He was heading somewhere. The certainty in his movement was the only thing that kept her own hope from flickering out. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped. They were at the edge of a wide, sandy channel, a dry wash where water might rage for a few hours a year and then vanish, leaving only bleached stones and silence. Jed released her hand and pointed to a dark cleft in the rock face on the other side of the wash. A shadow within a shadow. "There," he said, his voice the first sound to pass between them since his single-word command to jump. It was a low, gravelly sound, as rough as the land itself. They scrambled across the sandy bottom of the arroyo and into the opening. It was not a deep cave, but a shallow rock overhang, hollowed out by wind and water over countless centuries. It was low-ceilinged and offered little more than a floor of fine sand and a back wall to lean against. But it was shelter. It broke the wind, which had begun to carry a knife's edge of cold. And more importantly, it concealed them from view. The air inside smelled of cool stone and ancient dust. Ruth sank to the ground, her legs giving way completely. She leaned her head back against the rock, the cold seeping through her thin dress, a welcome shock after the heat of her exertion. She closed her eyes, and the world behind her eyelids was a chaotic swirl of motion, the train, the fall, the desperate flight. She heard Jed moving about just outside the shelter. There was the dry snap of brittle wood being broken over a knee. He was working methodically, his movements economical and sure. He returned a few minutes later with an armful of dead greasewood and mesquite branches. He knelt in the center of the shallow cave and began to build a small, careful pile of tinder. Ruth watched him through slitted eyes. His hands, which had seemed so immense and potentially brutal, were surprisingly deft. He worked with a quiet, focused competence that was more reassuring than any spoken promise. He took out a small piece of flint and steel from a leather pouch on his belt. There was a sharp, scraping sound, again and again. A tiny spark flew, then another, one caught in the driest of the tinder, a fragile orange ember. Jed lowered his head and blew on it. A soft, steady breath. The ember glowed, brightened, and then, with a soft whoosh, a tiny flame blossomed into life. The fire was a living thing in the vast darkness. It pushed back the oppressive gloom, creating a small, flickering circle of warmth and safety. It cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, turning their crude shelter into a sanctuary. The light fell on Jed's face, illuminating the harsh lines and planes that had been hidden by his hat. He had a strong, square jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth that seemed unused to smiling. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, were fixed on the flames. But she knew he was aware of everything, the crackle of the wood, the whisper of the wind outside, the sound of her own unsteady breathing. He looked up, and his gaze met hers. There was no judgment in his eyes, no accusation. There was only a quiet, unnerving assessment. He reached for the canteen on his belt, unscrewed the cap, and held it out to her. She shook her head. "You need it." "Take it," he said. It was not a suggestion. She took the canteen. It felt lighter than it should. When she put it to her lips, she realized why. She drank, and the water was the most precious thing she had ever tasted, cool and clean, washing the dust from her throat. She took only a few sips before trying to hand it back, but he just shook his head slightly, his eyes on the fire. She drank again, more deeply this time, until the canteen was empty. She knew, with a certainty that made her throat tighten, that he had given her the last of it. He set the empty canteen aside without comment and turned his attention to his own leg. He had torn his trousers in the fall, and a long, shallow gash ran along his calf. It was bleeding sluggishly. He took a kerchief from his pocket, poured a few drops from a small metal flask whiskey, from the sharp smell of it onto the cloth, and began to clean the wound with a detached, practical air. He winced as the alcohol bit into the raw flesh, the only sign of pain he allowed himself. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the flames. It was not an awkward silence. It was a solid, foundational thing, but it was a silence she felt compelled to fill. He had saved her, shielded her, given her his last drop of water. He deserved to know what kind of trouble he had leaped into. "My father," she began, her voice small and raspy. She clutched at her bodice, her fingers finding the hard outline of the necklace hidden there. "He likes to play cards. He's not very good at it." Jed continued to wrap the kerchief around his calf, his movements precise. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was listening. "He made a bargain," she continued, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, "with a man named Abernathy. My father lost everything, the farm, the stock, everything, and then he offered me." The word came out as a strangled whisper. "Abernathy was pleased with the arrangement. They called it a marriage, but it was a sale." She paused, watching his face in the firelight. It remained impassive, a mask of carved granite. His silence was unnerving, but it also gave her the space to continue. "I was supposed to be delivered to him in Santa Fe. He deals in more than just cattle." She couldn't bring herself to say the words, to give a name to the future that had almost claimed her. "The men on the train, they work for him. Silas. He was sent to make sure the bargain was honored." She finally looked down at her own hands, at the dirt and blood caked under her nails, the raw scrapes on her palms. I couldn't let that happen. So I took this." Her fingers closed around the necklace. "It was my mother's. It's all I have left of her. And I ran." She finished, her story hanging in the small, warm space between them. She had laid out the ugliest parts of her truth, a burden she expected him to cast aside. She waited for the blame, the anger, the cold realization that he had risked his life for a gambler's debt, a piece of damaged goods. Jed finished tying the knot on his makeshift bandage. He flexed his leg, then looked at the fire, his expression unchanged. He picked up a long, thin stick and poked at the embers, sending a shower of sparks up into the darkness. He did not look at her. He did not say, "That's a terrible thing." He did not say, "You did the right thing." He did not say anything at all. His lack of response was, in its own way, a form of absolution. He did not offer pity, because pity was for the helpless. He did not offer judgment, because he seemed to be a man who understood that the world was a hard place where people made hard choices. He simply accepted her story as he had accepted her presence as a fact. The past was a landscape they had already crossed. Now, there was only the night and what lay ahead. The fire began to die down, the circle of light shrinking. The cold of the desert seeped back into their shelter. Ruth shivered, pulling her torn dress tighter around herself, without a word. Jed stood, took off his heavy duster, and draped it over her shoulders. It was immense, enveloping her completely. It smelled of dust, sage, and the faint, masculine scent of the man himself. It was still warm from his body. He settled himself on the other side of the dying fire, his back against the rock wall, facing the entrance. He drew his Colt from its holster and rested it on his thigh. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but she knew he was not sleeping. He was watching. He was a guardian at the gate, a silent, unmovable presence between her and the vast, predatory darkness. Ruth lay down on the sand, pulling the duster over her like a heavy blanket. The ground was hard. The night was cold, and the men who were hunting her were still out there somewhere. She should have been terrified. She should have been staring into the darkness, listening for every snap of a twig, every howl of a distant coyote. But she wasn't. She watched the steady, dark silhouette of the man across the fire. She saw the unwavering line of his shoulders, the way he held his head, alert and patient. There were no words of love between them, no promises whispered in the dark. There was no romance in the hard reality of their situation. There was only this, a silent, shared existence, a mutual acknowledgement of the will to survive. He was a stranger, yet in the space of a single night, he had become her protector, and under his silent, watchful gaze, shielded by his coat, warmed by the embers of his fire, Ruth closed her eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless, and peaceful sleep. The dawn came not with a gentle blush, but with a sharp, silver line drawn across the eastern horizon. It was a cold, unforgiving light that offered no warmth, only visibility. Jed was already awake, a dark shape sitting motionless by the gray ashes of the fire. He had not slept. When Ruth stirred, pushing the heavy duster off, he simply stood, his movements stiff from the night's chill and the wound on his leg. He looked out at the vast, empty landscape, then back at her. His face was a mask of grim determination. He didn't need to speak. It was time to move. Their journey was a silent pilgrimage through a world of rock and sun. Jed led the way, his limp a steady, persistent rhythm. He seemed to know the land not as a map, but as an extension of himself. He found paths that were invisible to her, narrow animal trails that wound through the thorny scrub and rock falls. He moved with an economy of energy, never wasting a step, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the ground, the sky. He found water for them in a place she would have overlooked 1,000 times as shallow, shaded depression in a flat slab of rock, where a small amount of rainwater had collected and been shielded from the sun. He called it a tinaja. He drank first, just a mouthful, then passed the canteen to her after refilling it. The water was warm and tasted of stone, but it was life. Ruth followed without complaint. The initial terror of the chase had been burned away by the sun, leaving a core of pure, stubborn will. She focused on the simple mechanics of survival, placing one foot in front of the other, watching where Jed stepped, conserving her breath. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared space. It was filled with the crunch of their boots on the gravel, the whisper of the wind, the distant cry of a hawk circling in the vast blue emptiness above. They were two solitary creatures moving through an immense landscape, their companionship forged not in words, but in the shared hardship of each step. By the second day, a new rhythm had established itself. They walked from sunrise until the sun was at its highest, its heat a physical blow. Then they would find what little shade they could, a rock outcropping or the sparse shadow of a palo verde tree, and rest through the worst of the heat. In the late afternoon, as the light softened and the shadows grew long, they would walk again, until the last light faded from the sky. Late in the afternoon of that second day, they crested a high ridge, and Jed stopped. Ruth came to stand beside him, her chest heaving, following his gaze. Below them, nestled at the very foot of a series of rugged, saw-toothed mountains, was a small homestead. It was so isolated, so utterly surrounded by the vastness of the wilderness, that it looked less like a home and more like something that had sprouted from the earth itself. There was a small, sturdy cabin built of thick, dark logs, chinked with mud. Its roof was made of sod, and a thin curl of gray smoke rose from a stone chimney, a fragile thread of life against the immense backdrop of the mountains. Beside the cabin stood a rough corral holding a few wiry-looking horses, and a small pen that contained a handful of goats, a vegetable garden, protected by a low fence of woven branches, was a patch of defiant green against the overwhelming brown and ochre of the landscape. The entire place was an island of human endeavor in an ocean of wilderness. It was the edge of nowhere. "This is it," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. Relief washed over Ruth, so potent it almost buckled her knees, but it was followed swiftly by a cold spike of anxiety. This was his home, his sanctuary. She was an outsider, a piece of trouble he had picked up along the way. His duty to her, if he had ever felt one, was surely over. He had brought her to safety, away from the rail line and her pursuers. Now he would give her a piece of bread, point her in the direction of the nearest town, likely a week's walk away, and send her on her path. The thought was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. They made their way down the slope. As they drew closer, a large, shaggy dog with one floppy ear trotted out from behind the cabin, letting out a series of low, questioning barks. Jed spoke a single word. "Hush!" and the dog's tail gave a tentative wag. It fell into step beside him, sniffing at his heels. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment of dismissal. She prepared herself for the words, rehearsing a thank you that felt pitifully inadequate. She would not beg. She had run from one kind of servitude. She would not plead for another. Jed walked to the cabin door, a simple plank affair with leather hinges, and pushed it open. He stood on the threshold, his large frame filling the opening, and looked back at her. She had stopped a few feet away, a dusty, disheveled figure in a torn dress, waiting for her sentence. The silence stretched, thick with her unspoken fears. He seemed to read the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she held herself, poised for flight. His expression didn't soften, but the storm in his eyes seemed to calm for a moment. "Stay," he said. The word was rough, almost a command. Then he added two more, and they changed everything. "If you want." The choice. He was giving her a choice. It was a gift so unexpected, so profound, that she could not immediately process it. It was the first real choice she had been offered since she had decided to run. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, hot and sharp, but she blinked them away. She would not cry, not now. She simply gave a short, jerky nod. It was all the answer she could manage. He nodded back, as if the matter was settled, and stepped inside. After a moment's hesitation, Ruth followed him into the cabin. The inside was as simple and sturdy as the outside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a small fire crackled merrily. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and drying herbs that hung in bunches from the rafters. There was a rough-hewn table with two stools, a cot in one corner covered with a thick wool blanket, and shelves on the wall holding a few tin plates, a cast-iron skillet, and some sacks of flour and beans. It was a Spartan existence, but everything was clean, ordered, and purposeful. It was the home of a man who wasted nothing, not even space. Then she saw it. In the corner opposite Jed's cot was a much smaller bed, neatly made, and on top of it sat a small, crudely carved wooden horse. Before she could even form a question, a small figure emerged from the shadows behind the fireplace. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with a cascade of tangled, sun-streaked hair and a smudged face. She wore a simple shift dress that had been patched at the elbow. But it was her eyes that caught Ruth's attention. They were huge and startlingly blue, and they were fixed on Jed with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. "Uncle Jed!" she cried, her voice clear as a bell. She ran to him and threw her arms around his legs, hugging him tightly. The transformation in Jed was instantaneous and astonishing. The hard, unyielding lines of his body seemed to soften. He placed a large, calloused hand on the girl's head, his touch impossibly gentle. "June," he rumbled, and the name itself seemed to hold a world of affection. "Did you keep the fire going?" "Yes, sir," she said, looking up at him proudly. "And I fed the goats, all of them." "Good girl." He looked from the child to Ruth, who stood awkwardly by the door, feeling like an intruder in this intensely private world. "June, this is Ruth. She'll be staying with us for a spell." June's bright blue eyes turned to Ruth. It was the curious, unflinching gaze of a child. She looked at Ruth's torn dress, her dusty face, and her wild hair. Ruth braced herself for the suspicion, the questions, But June simply smiled, a wide, gap-toothed grin that lit up her whole face. "Hello," she said. "Are you hungry? We have stew?" And just like that, the tension in Ruth's shoulders eased. The child's simple, unconditional acceptance was a balm to her raw nerves. "Yes," Ruth managed to say, her voice thick. "I am." Thus began her life on the edge of nowhere. There were no formal arrangements, no discussions of terms or duration. She was simply there. Ruth understood instinctively that to be idle was to be a burden, and a burden would not be tolerated for long. So she found her own purpose in the small, daily rhythms of the homestead. She woke with the first light, the same cold silver dawn she had met in the desert. But here, it was a promise, not a threat. While Jed went out to see to the horses and the outer fences, Ruth would take the buckets to the well, the simple, repetitive motion of drawing water a soothing balm. She learned to milk the surprisingly stubborn goats, her hands, at first clumsy and weak, slowly growing stronger and more confident. She helped June scatter feed for the chickens and collect their eggs, listening to the child's endless, cheerful chatter, a sound as bright and welcome as bird song. She took over the inside of the cabin. She swept the plank floors until they were free of dust. She washed their few clothes in a wooden basin with harsh lye soap and hung them to dry in the relentless sun. She learned to cook on the open hearth, turning their simple stores of beans, cornmeal, and salted pork into passable meals. She discovered that Jed was a silent, voracious eater who would clean his plate without a word of praise or complaint. His approval was in the simple fact that he ate what she made. June became her shadow, her small, constant companion. The child was full of questions, but never about Ruth's past. She wanted to know if Ruth could braid hair, she could. If she knew any stories, she knew a few. And if she thought the one-eared dog, Buck, was the bravest dog in the whole territory, she agreed that he probably was. Ruth learned about Jed through the child. She learned he had found June 2 years prior, the sole survivor of a wagon attacked by bandits, and had brought her here. She learned he had built the cabin himself, log by log. She learned he was the one who had carved the little wooden horse, and that he was teaching her to read from a tattered old Bible, the only book they owned. Through these small revelations, the image of Jed, the silent, dangerous giant from the train, was slowly replaced by a more complex picture. He was still silent, still formidable. But he was also a man who could gently splint the broken leg of a goat, who could listen with infinite patience to a 7-year-old's rambling account of her day, and who had, without question, taken in 2 lost and broken females and given them his protection. The 3 of them fell into a routine that was as unspoken as it was unbreakable. In the evenings, after the last of the chores were done, they would sit together by the fire. Jed would smoke his pipe, his eyes on the flames, lost in his own thoughts. June would often sit on the floor by his boots, practicing her letters on a piece of slate, and Ruth would sit on the other stool, mending a tear in June's dress or patching one of Jed's shirts, the simple, rhythmic work of her needle a quiet counterpoint to the crackling fire. No one spoke of what they were. They were not a family in any conventional sense. There were no bonds of blood or marriage. There were no words of love or even affection spoken between the 2 adults. But as the days turned into a week, and a week turned into 2, Ruth began to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. It was a fragile, tentative thing, easily broken, but it was there nonetheless. It was the feeling of belonging. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the door and sending gusts of wind down the chimney, the 3 of them were huddled close to the hearth. June, sleepy and warm, had crawled into Jed's lap, a rare show of physical affection he allowed without comment. She was already half asleep, her head resting against his solid chest. Ruth was stirring a pot of stew, the savory steam warming her face. The dog, Buck, was curled up at Jed's feet, twitching in his sleep. The cabin was a small, warm pocket of safety in the vast, raging wilderness. In that moment, looking at the giant of a man holding the sleeping child, Ruth realized they had become a family without ever having a conversation about it. They were a silent, unspoken, accidental family, forged in desperation and bound together by the simple, shared need for shelter from the storm. And for the first time since she had run, the fear in her heart was quiet. She was no longer just a runaway. She was home. The fragile peace of the homestead was a delicate thing, a thin pane of glass against which the storms of the past still beat. Ruth felt its presence in the quiet moments when she would look up from her mending and find Jed's unreadable eyes on her, or when a rider appeared as a speck on the distant horizon, causing her heart to seize in her chest until they turned and rode away. She had told him a part of her story, the bare, necessary bones of it. But the flesh and blood of the true nature of the man named Abernathy and the full weight of her father's betrayal, remained a secret she held clutched tight in her soul. The weight of it grew heavier with each passing day. It felt like a dishonesty, a shadow she cast over the simple goodness of this place. She was an accepted part of the rhythm of their lives. She fetched the water. She cooked the meals. She patched June's dresses. But she was living under a false pretense. She was not just a girl fleeing a disagreeable marriage. She was a piece of property that a very determined man believed he had bought and paid for. The moment to speak came one evening, not in a storm, but in its aftermath. The air was washed clean, and the setting sun painted the western sky in brilliant, bloody strokes of orange and crimson. June was already asleep on her cot, her breathing soft and even. Jed sat on the small stoop outside the cabin, cleaning his rifle with a quiet, methodical focus, the metallic clicks of the action sharp in the still air. Ruth came out with a cup of coffee for him, a ritual she had started, and sat on the step below him. For a long while, they said nothing, simply watching the last of the light bleed from the sky. Her hand went, as it often did, to her bodice, her fingers tracing the outline of the hidden necklace. It was now or never. "There's more to it," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the vast silence. Jed paused his work, his hands still on the rifle, but his attention was fully on her. He did not prompt her, did not ask a single question. He simply waited, giving her the space and the silence to find her words. "The man my father lost to? Abernathy, he's not just a rancher or a gambler." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to say the words that shamed her. "He is a man who deals in contracts, for men in the mining camps and the boom towns, contracts for companionship, for girls who have no choice. My father didn't just arrange a marriage. He sold me into a life I couldn't bear." The confession hung in the air, ugly and stark. She kept her eyes on the darkening mountains, unable to look at him, to see the disgust or pity she was sure would be on his face. "Before I left," she went on, her voice gaining a sliver of strength as she moved from shame to defiance, "I took something. My father had already packed it away to be sold with my mother's other things." Slowly, she reached into the collar of her dress and pulled out the necklace. In the faint, dying light, it was a strange and beautiful thing. It was not made of gold or fine jewels, but of silver, hammered into intricate, unfamiliar patterns, with a single, smooth, dark stone at its center. It was unlike anything commonly seen in the territory, heavy and old, carrying the weight of generations. "This was my mother's, and her mother's before that. My mother, she wasn't from around here. Her people came from the south, long ago. After she passed, people in our town, my father included, they started to say this was a bad luck piece, a hex. They said it was why his luck at cards was so poor, why the crops failed. He was glad to be rid of it." She held it out on her palm, the metal cool against her skin. It was the physical embodiment of her past, her heritage, and her rebellion. It was the reason she was hunted, and the only thing of value she owned in the world. She had finally laid her entire wretched story at his feet. She was not just Ruth, the runaway. She was Ruth Miller, daughter of a weak man, sold to a wicked one, clutching a piece of silver that the world called a curse. Jed finished reassembling his rifle, the final click of the lever echoing with finality. He set the weapon aside carefully, then looked at the necklace in her hand. His stormy eyes studied it for a long moment, but he made no move to touch it. He looked from the silver heirloom to her face, his gaze direct and unwavering. The silence stretched, and in it, Ruth felt her entire future being weighed and judged. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain, devoid of sentiment, a simple statement of his own unshakable code. "Things don't define people," he said, his eyes holding hers, "but choices do." It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was something far more profound. It was acknowledgement. He was not looking at her as a victim of her father or of Abernathy. He was looking at her as the person who had made a choice, the choice to take what was hers, the choice to run, the choice to survive. He was seeing not her circumstances, but her will. With that single sentence, he lifted the burden of her past from her shoulders. He did not dismiss it, but he put it in its proper place. It was a part of her story, but it was not the end of it. The choices she made from this day forward were what mattered. He stood then, a towering silhouette against the star-dusted sky. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow, you learn to ride properly." He did not touch the necklace. He did not speak of her confession again. He simply changed the subject, turning from the past to the practical, immediate future. The next morning, the lessons began. He chose for her not the large, powerful stallion he rode, but a smaller, calmer mare named Dusty. Ruth had ridden before, but always on a gentle pony. Side saddle and proper, this was different. Jed showed her how to saddle the mare herself, his large hands guiding hers, showing her how to tighten the cinch, how to check the stirrups. He taught her to mount like a man, astride the horse, a position that felt scandalous and yet powerfully liberating. "A horse knows when you're scared," he told her, his voice patient. "She'll test you. You just have to let her know you're the one leading. Don't fight her. Guide her." The first few days were a struggle of sore muscles and bruised pride, but Jed was a relentlessly patient teacher. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration. He communicated in short, direct commands. Heels down. Look where you want to go, not at the ground. Breathe. Slowly, she began to find her balance, to feel the rhythm of the horse beneath her, to understand the subtle language of pressure from her knees and a light touch on the reins. After a week of riding, when she could handle the mare at a walk, a trot, and a shaky canter around the corral, he moved on to the next lesson. One afternoon, he came out of the cabin and handed her a pistol. It was a Colt Peacemaker, smaller than his own, but still shockingly heavy in her hand. The cold, dense weight of it was terrifying. "I don't want you to be a target," he said simply. "I want you to be a threat." He set up old tins on a fence post 50 feet away. He showed her how to stand, how to hold the gun with both hands to steady it, how to line up the sights. "It's a tool," he said, his voice calm and low. "Nothing more. It does what you tell it to do. You aim, you control your breath, and you squeeze the trigger. Don't ever pull it." Her first shot was a deafening explosion of sound and fury. The gun bucked in her hands, and the bullet kicked up dust a good 10 feet to the left of the target. Her ears rang, and the smell of sulfur filled the air. She was shaking. "Again," was all he said. Day after day, they practiced. The riding gave her freedom. The shooting gave her something else. It gave her a sense of control over her own fate. Each time she fired the gun, the sound was a little less jarring. Each time she hit a can, sending it spinning into the dust, a small, hard kernel of confidence grew within her. She was no longer just the girl who ran. She was becoming the woman who could stand her ground. June would often watch these lessons from the cabin doorway, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She never seemed afraid. In her world, Uncle Jed was the ultimate authority, and if he was teaching Ruth to do these things, then they were right and necessary. Through these shared, silent rituals, the unspoken distance between Ruth and Jed began to shrink until it was almost non-existent. They worked together as a seamless unit. When mending a fence, she would hold the post steady while he drove it into the hard earth, handing him the hammer just before he would have asked for it. They moved around the small cabin in a silent choreography, never bumping into one another. The trust between them was not built on confessions or promises. It was built on the solid foundation of shared labor and mutual respect. He trusted her to keep his home, to care for his child. She trusted him with her life. Sometimes, in the evenings, a new kind of silence would fall between them. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. He would look up from oiling a piece of leather, and his eyes would meet hers across the firelight. For a fleeting moment, the storm in their depths would recede, and she would see something else, something quiet and deep. It wasn't softness, not exactly. It was a look of profound presence, of acknowledgement. He saw her, not as a burden or a refugee, but as a part of the landscape of his life, as essential as the well, the fire, and the child sleeping in the corner. And in his gaze, Ruth found that she was no longer just hiding in his shadow. She was standing in his light. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. The hard edges of Ruth's fear began to soften, worn smooth by the relentless, simple demands of the homestead. The past was not forgotten, but it had receded, becoming a distant storm on a far horizon, its thunder too faint to be a threat. The present was real and solid, the warmth of the sun on her back as she weeded the small garden, the rough texture of a horse's reins in her hands, the sound of June's laughter as they fetched water from the well. This fragile contentment was at its peak one late afternoon. The sun, beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, bathed the small valley in a thick, golden light. The air was still and warm, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains and the dry, sweet smell of the dust. Ruth and June were by the well, their chore of drawing the evening's water long since finished. They had fallen into a game, dipping a tin cup into the bucket and watching the water catch the light as they poured it out, creating fleeting, sparkling rainbows in the air. June's giggles were the only sound, a bright, happy noise in the immense quiet. Ruth watched her, a tightness in her chest that was not fear, but a fierce, protective affection. The child, once a stranger, had become the anchor of her new life. In June's unquestioning acceptance, Ruth had found a reflection of a person she had forgotten. She could be someone capable of giving comfort, of being needed, of being part of a whole. It was Buck, the one-eared dog, who sensed it first. He was lying in a patch of shade near the cabin, dozing in the afternoon heat. Suddenly, his head lifted, the good ear twitching. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ruth murmured, her hand instinctively going to June's shoulder. She followed the dog's gaze toward the low ridge that marked the only real approach to the cabin. At first, she saw nothing. Then, she caught a faint haze of dust, stirred by something moving slowly, deliberately, in their direction. Her blood ran cold. Jed was out, checking a line of snares he had set in the high country. He wasn't due back for another hour. They were alone. "June!" she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the panic that was clawing at her throat. "Let's go inside." June, seeing the look on Ruth's face, didn't argue. She took Ruth's hand, her own small one trembling slightly. As they moved toward the cabin, the figures crested the ridge. 3 riders. They were not moving quickly. There was a terrible, predatory patience in their pace. They knew they had their prey cornered. Ruth shoved June into the cabin ahead of her and barred the heavy plank door. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She ran to the small, grimy window and peered out. The riders were closer now, close enough for her to see their faces, and the last vestiges of her fragile peace shattered into a million pieces. The man in the lead was Silas. His thin, weasel-like face was set in a triumphant sneer. To his right was the brawny, dull-eyed man from the train car, the one Jed had swatted away like a fly. And on his left was the younger one, a nervous, fidgety man with shifty eyes. They had found her. After all this time, after she had allowed herself to believe she was safe. They had tracked her to the edge of nowhere. "They're here," she whispered, the words barely audible. June, who had been standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with fear, let out a small whimper and ran to hide behind the woodpile near the hearth. Ruth's mind raced. The pistol Jed had taught her to use was in a box under his cot. The rifle was on its pegs above the fireplace. But what good were they? She was one woman, with a terrified child, against 3 armed men. Her lessons with Jed had given her confidence, but this was not a tin can on a fence post. This was real. The riders stopped 100 feet from the cabin, a calculated, intimidating distance. Silas dismounted slowly, his movements theatrical. He took in the small homestead, the cabin, the corral, the goats with an appraising look, as if he were already counting his master's new assets. Ruth Miller. Silas's voice cut through the air, oily and smug. "We know you're in there. Your father's worried sick, mister. Abernathy is a forgiving man. Come on out, and we can all go home. No one needs to get hurt." The lie was so blatant, so insulting, that a hot flash of anger cut through Ruth's fear. She did not answer. She stood frozen by the window, her mind a blank wall of terror. And then, a sound from behind the cabin, the soft thud of horses' hooves on dirt. Jed, he had come back early. He must have seen the riders from the high ground and circled around. A wave of relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over her. The cabin door opened behind her. Ruth spun around to see Jed step inside. His face was a thundercloud. His stormy eyes narrowed to slits. He had seen everything. He looked at Ruth, then at the small, trembling form of June hiding behind the wood. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence filled the small room, a silent, terrible promise of violence. He crossed the cabin in 2 long strides and took the shotgun from its pegs above the fireplace. It was not his rifle. It was a coach gun, a heavy, double-barreled weapon designed for close, brutal work. He broke it open, his movements economical and sure, and slid 2 brass shells into the chambers. The click, as he snapped it shut, was the loudest sound Ruth had ever heard. It was the sound of a final line being drawn. Without a word to her, he turned and stepped back outside, letting the cabin door swing shut behind him. Ruth rushed back to the window. Jed stood on the stoop, the shotgun held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He was a mountain of a man, an unmovable object standing between his home and the men who had come to defile it. Silas chuckled, a dry, nasty sound. "Well now, Knox, I should have known we'd find you in the middle of this. Always picking up strays. Ain't you this one's promised goods? You got no claim here." Jed remained silent, his stillness more menacing than any threat. "I don't want to kill you," Silas continued, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "But I will. There's 3 of us. You do the math. Get off my land," Jed said. His voice was not loud, but it carried an absolute authority, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "This ain't your land anymore," Silas sneered. "It belongs to the man who owns the girl, and that's Mr. Abernathy." The standoff was absolute. The air was thick with it, a heavy, suffocating blanket of imminent violence. Ruth watched, her knuckles white where she gripped the window frame, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw the younger man on Silas's left shift nervously in his saddle, his eyes darting from Jed to the cabin, then to the well. And then she understood. It wasn't just a standoff, it was a distraction. With a sudden, desperate cry, she turned from the window. "June, stay back!" But it was too late. The younger man had dismounted on the far side of his horse, out of Jed's line of sight. He had used the tense conversation as cover to circle around the cabin. Now. He kicked open the back door, a flimsy door used for the garden, one they never bothered to bar. He was inside before Ruth could even move. He was on June in a flash, grabbing her from behind her hiding place. June let out a terrified shriek. The man, Coley, dragged her struggling and crying out the front door, into the golden afternoon light. He was clumsy and terrified himself, but his grip was firm. He held June in front of him, a small, human shield. And then he did the unforgivable. He pulled a knife, its blade glinting in the sun, and held it to June's throat. "Jed!" Ruth screamed, her voice tearing from her raw throat as she stumbled out onto the stoop. The world seemed to stop. The lazy afternoon, the golden light, the peaceful quiet, it all vanished, replaced by this single, horrific tableau. Jed, who had been focused entirely on Silas, turned his head. The look on his face was something Ruth would never forget. It was not fear, it was not even rage. It was a look of pure, agonizing torment, the look of a man whose soul was being ripped from his body. "Drop it, Knox," Silas said, his voice soft and triumphant. He had won. He knew it. "Drop the scattergun. Real slow." Jed's knuckles were white where he gripped the shotgun. His entire body was a coiled spring of murderous intent. Ruth could see the war being fought behind his eyes. He could kill Silas and the other man before they could even draw, but not before the terrified man holding June could twitch his hand. June was sobbing now, her small body trembling. "Uncle Jed," she cried, her voice a tiny, broken thing. That was what broke him. The sound of her voice, the immense strength seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound and terrible weariness. The shotgun suddenly seemed too heavy for him to hold. Slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural, he bent and placed the shotgun on the dusty ground of the stoop. "Good boy," Silas crooned, savoring his victory. "Now the pistol. Unbuckle the belt. Let it drop." Jed complied, his eyes never leaving June's terrified face. The heavy gun belt, with its holstered Colt, fell into the dust with a soft thud. He stood there, disarmed, his hands empty and open at his sides. He was powerless. "Now get on your knees," Silas commanded, his voice dripping with venom. "I want to see you on your knees in your own dirt." For a moment, Ruth thought he would refuse. She saw the muscles in his jaw clench, a final, defiant spark in his stormy eyes. But then he looked at June, at the thin line of red that had appeared on her neck where the blade pressed too hard, and the spark died. With a sound that was almost a groan of physical pain, Jed Knox, the giant, the protector, the immovable mountain, slowly, agonizingly, lowered himself to his knees. The dust puffed up around him, a small, ignominious cloud. He was a king brought low, a fortress breached, his strength rendered utterly meaningless by his love for the child he had sworn to protect. Silas threw back his head and laughed, the sound a desecration in the quiet, golden air. Time did not slow down. It shattered. The golden afternoon light, the still air, the scent of pine, it all fractured into a million sharp, unbearable pieces. All that existed for Ruth was the scene before her, Jed on his knees, a titan humbled in the dust, Silas, a vulture gloating over his prize, and June, a tiny, trembling bird with a blade at her throat, her sobs the only sound in a world that had stopped breathing. Silas's laughter, a sound like dry leaves skittering over gravestones, echoed in the unnatural quiet. It was a sound of absolute victory, of cruel, leisurely power. He savored the moment, turning Jed's humiliation over in his mind like a fine jewel. This focus, this supreme arrogance, was his mistake. He was so consumed by the sight of the strong man brought low that he forgot to watch the woman. For Ruth, the world had dissolved into a roaring white noise of terror. Her mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by horror. But through that roaring void, she saw Jed's face. She saw the torment in his eyes, an agony so profound it was physical. It was not the look of a man fearing his own death, but of a man watching his world die, in that single, terrible glance. He was not a giant or a protector. He was a man laid bare, his heart exposed and helpless. And something inside Ruth shifted. The blank wall of terror did not crumble. It was obliterated, replaced by a single, cold point of purpose. The fear for herself was gone. The memory of her father's betrayal was gone. All that remained was a clarity so fierce it was almost serene. They had made a mistake. They had hurt the child. They had broken the man who had sheltered her. They had threatened her home. Her movements were small, almost imperceptible. She took one step back, then another, melting into the deep shadows of the cabin's doorway. Silas's eyes were on Jed. The other man, the brawny one, was watching his leader. A stupid grin on his face, the man holding June, Coley, was so terrified himself. His focus was entirely on the knife in his hand and the struggling child. No one was watching her. She slipped back inside the cabin. The air was thick with the lingering scent of fear. Her eyes darted around the room. The rifle was too high, too clumsy. The pistol was under the cot, too far. Then, a memory surfaced. A piece of a conversation with June just a week before. Uncle Jed keeps the old snake gun in the goat shed, in case of coyotes. The goat shed, it shared a low, connected roof with the main cabin. A small, lean-to structure with a door that opened into the pen. She moved past the hearth, her feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. She slid through the back door, the one Coley had kicked in, and found herself in the small, dusty patch of ground between the cabin and the garden. The goat pen was just ahead. The goats, sensing the tension in the air, were huddled in the far corner, their strange, rectangular pupils wide with alarm. Ruth kept low, using the corner of the cabin as cover. She reached the flimsy door of the shed and slipped inside. The smell of hay, dust, and the warm, musky scent of animals filled her nostrils. Light filtered through the cracks in the walls in dusty shafts. And there it was. Not on a rack, but resting on a high shelf, tucked behind a sack of feed, an old Remington revolver. It was not like Jed's polished Colt. This gun was older, its metal pitted and worn, its wooden grip smooth from years of use. It was a tool, not a showpiece, a working gun for a working man. Her hands did not shake as she took it down. It was heavy, but it was a familiar weight now. Her lessons with Jed came back to her, not as memories, but as pure instinct. Check the load. She broke it open. He kept it loaded with 5 rounds, the hammer resting on an empty chamber. Always, she snapped it shut, the sound a dull, final click in the small space. She crept to the edge of the shed's door, which gave her a clear, angled view of the scene outside. She could see them all. Jed, still on his knees, his head bowed, a posture of such profound defeat it tore at her. Silas, now taking a step toward Jed, his intent clear, and Coley, his arm wrapped around June's chest, the knife still glinting. He was her target, not Silas, not the other one, the immediate threat, the one holding the child. It's a tool. It does what you tell it to do. Jed's voice was a calm presence in the storm of her mind. She had never shot at a living thing before, not even a rabbit. The thought of shooting a man, of taking a life, was a universe away from her reality. But she was not thinking of the man. She was thinking of the knife. She was looking at the tear track on June's dusty cheek. She raised the heavy gun, bringing it up with both hands, just as Jed had taught her. Her arms protested the weight, but she locked her elbows, making a solid platform. The world narrowed. The golden light, the mountains, The cabinet all fell away. All that existed was the V-notch of the rear sight and the steel blade of the front sight. She lined them up on Coley's right shoulder, the one holding the knife. Not the head, not the heart, the shoulder, the arm, the threat. "Control your breath. Squeeze. Don't ever pull." She let out half a breath and held it. The sights steadied. A perfect, deadly alignment. She did not blink. She did not hesitate. Her finger tightened on the trigger. A slow, steady, controlled pressure. The explosion was a physical blow. The old Remington bucked in her hands like a living thing. The sound a flat, brutal crack that ripped the afternoon apart. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, Coley let out a high, thin scream. A dark red flower bloomed on his shoulder, and his arm went limp. The knife clattered harmlessly to the ground. His grip on June slackened, and the child, released, stumbled away from him, falling to her knees in the dirt. The gunshot was a starting pistol for hell. The instant the shot rang out, Jed moved. He did not rise. He exploded. He launched himself forward from his knees like a cannonball, a blur of motion and raw power. The brawny man standing near Silas was still turning his head toward the sound of the shot, his mouth agape in stupid surprise. He never had a chance. Jed slammed into him, his shoulder driving into the man's midsection, lifting him off his feet and hurling him backward. The man's head hit the corner of the wooden water trough with a sickening, hollow crunch. He collapsed like a sack of grain and did not move. Silas, his victory turned to ashes in his mouth, fumbled for his own pistol. He was fast, but Jed was a force of nature. Jed spun, his hand grabbing the shotgun from the stoop where he'd dropped it. He didn't even raise it to his shoulder. He swung it like a club, the heavy steel barrels catching Silas square in the jaw. The sound of breaking bone was sharp and ugly. Silas went down, spitting blood and teeth, his pistol firing uselessly into the sky. It had taken less than 5 seconds. The third man, Coley, was clutching his shattered shoulder, his face a mask of white-hot pain and disbelief. He stared at Ruth, who was now stepping out from the cover of the goat shed. The old Remington still held steady in her hands. He looked at the carnage around him, at the unmoving body by the trough, at his boss writhing on the ground. He looked at Jed, who was now rising to his full, terrifying height, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. Coley made the only choice a coward could. He turned and ran. He scrambled for his horse, clawing his way into the saddle with his one good arm, and spurred the animal into a frantic, panicked gallop. Ruth did not lower the gun. The fear had not returned. In its place was a cold, hard rage. This was her home. This was her family. He had put a knife to her child. She walked forward, her boots stirring the dust. She did not run. Her steps were measured, deliberate. She walked past the moaning form of Silas, past Jed, who had gone to kneel beside the sobbing, terrified June. She walked to the center of the yard and stopped, raising the heavy pistol again. The fleeing rider was a receding target, 100 yards away and growing smaller. She took her stance again, just as Jed had taught her. The world narrowed once more. She breathed. She aimed. She squeezed the trigger. The gun roared a second time. The bullet whined past the rider's ear, close enough for him to feel the hornet's sting of its passage. It wasn't a hit, but it was a message. It was a promise. It was the final, definitive word. It said, "This place is protected. You are not welcome here. Do not ever come back." The rider screamed, a thin thread of terror on the wind, and dug his heels even harder into his horse's flanks, disappearing over the ridge in a cloud of desperate dust. Silence descended. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by June's ragged sobs and the low, piteous moans of Silas. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sharp, sulphurous tang of gunpowder. The golden afternoon light seemed to mock the brutal, bloody scene on the ground. Ruth stood there for a long moment, the heavy gun still in her hand, its barrel smoking slightly. She was no longer the girl who had whispered, "I'm the virgin they warned you about." She was not the frightened runaway huddling under a stranger's coat. She was the woman who had taken the shot, the woman who had defended her home. She finally lowered the gun, her arms trembling from the strain, and looked over at Jed. He was holding June, stroking her hair, murmuring soft, comforting words to her. He looked up, and his stormy eyes met hers across the blood-soaked yard. And in their depths, she saw something new, respect, and something that looked terrifyingly like awe. The echo of the second gunshot faded, absorbed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence thick with the scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of fresh blood. The golden light of the setting sun, which had moments ago seemed so warm and benevolent, now cast long, accusatory shadows, illuminating the brutal tableau in the dust. Ruth stood frozen, the old Remington still heavy in her hand. Her arms trembled, not with fear, but with the aftermath of an adrenaline surge so potent it felt like lightning had passed through her veins. She looked at the scene as if from a great distance, the unmoving form by the water trough, Silas, curled on the ground, making wet, guttural sounds of pain, and Jed, a dark, solid shape, kneeling beside the small, crumpled form of June. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, she moved. Her legs felt unsteady, disconnected from her body. She walked toward them, her eyes fixed on the child. June was no longer sobbing, but her small body was racked with silent, shuddering tremors. Jed had his arms around her, holding her tight against his chest, his large hand stroking her tangled hair. He was murmuring to her, his voice a low, soothing rumble that was at odds with the violence that had just transpired. "It's over, little bird," he was saying, the nickname a rare and tender thing. "It's all over now. You're safe." Ruth knelt beside them, the gun still in her hand. She reached out a trembling hand and touched June's cheek. The child flinched at her touch, her wide, terrified blue eyes staring at nothing. "June," Ruth said, her voice a cracked whisper. "It's me. It's Ruth. You're safe." At the sound of her voice, June's focus seemed to return. Her gaze shifted from the empty space in front of her to Ruth's face. A fresh wave of sobs broke from her, and she launched herself from Jed's arms into Ruth's, burying her face in Ruth's neck. Ruth dropped the gun into the dust and wrapped her arms around the child, holding her as tightly as she could, absorbing the child's terror into herself. Jed rose to his feet, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He looked down at Silas, who was trying to push himself up, one arm held at a grotesque angle. Without a word, Jed walked over, picked up the man's fallen pistol, and tucked it into his own belt. He then took Silas's gun belt and his knife, disarming him completely. He did it all with a detached, methodical efficiency, a man cleaning up a mess. It was only then, as he turned back, that Ruth saw it. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the side of his shirt, just above his hip, in the chaos of the fight, in the blur of motion. Silas's wild shot had not been as useless as it had seemed. "Jed," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. "You're hurt." He glanced down at his side as if noticing it for the first time. "It's a scratch," he said, his voice flat. But even as he spoke, he swayed, putting a hand out to the cabin wall to steady himself. The scratch was more than a scratch. "Get June inside," he ordered, his voice strained. "Bar the door." Ruth scooped the still sobbing child into her arms. "What about them?" she asked, nodding toward the two men on the ground. "I'll handle them," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Go!" She obeyed, carrying June into the cabin. The inside was a haven of familiar shadows and the scent of wood smoke, a stark contrast to the blood-soaked yard. She settled June on her small cot, pulling the wool blanket up to her chin. The child clung to her hand, her eyes still wide with shock. "You stay right here," Ruth whispered. "Everything is going to be all right." She wasn't sure if she believed the words herself, but she said them with as much conviction as she could muster. She barred the heavy front door, then the flimsy back one, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear sounds from outside, the grunt of a man in pain, the drag of a heavy body through the dirt. She did not want to know what Jed was doing. She only knew that he was making them safe. She lit a lantern, the soft yellow light pushing back the encroaching darkness. Then she went to Jed's cot, found a clean cloth, and filled a basin with water from the bucket by the door. She waited. It felt like an eternity before the bar on the door lifted and Jed stumbled in. He was pale under his tan, his face drawn and tight with pain. He leaned heavily against the door as he slid the bar back into place. "It's done," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The finality in his tone was enough. Silas and his man would not be troubling them again. He pushed himself away from the door and staggered toward his cot, slumping down onto the edge of it with a heavy groan. Ruth was at his side in an instant. "Let me see," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He didn't protest. She carefully pulled the torn, bloody fabric of his shirt away from the wound. It was a deep, ragged gouge along his side, oozing blood sluggishly. A bullet had torn through the flesh. It was not a fatal wound, but it was a serious one. It needed to be cleaned and bound tightly. "The whiskey," he grunted, nodding toward a small bottle on the mantel. She fetched it, along with the cleanest cloth she could find. She knew what she had to do. She poured the raw, fiery liquid directly onto the cloth, her hand steady despite the tremor she felt deep inside. "This will hurt," she said softly. "Just do it," he breathed, his jaw clenched. She pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to the wound. He let out a sharp, ragged hiss of breath through his teeth, his entire body going rigid, but he made no other sound. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her movements gentle but efficient. The bleeding slowed. Now she needed a bandage, something clean and strong to bind it with. The cloths she had were not enough. Without a second thought, she took the hem of her own worn calico dress. It was the same dress she had been wearing when she'd fled, a tattered symbol of her old life. With a firm, decisive motion, she ripped a long, wide strip from the bottom. The sound of the tearing fabric was loud in the quiet cabin. She folded the strip into a thick pad and placed it over the wound, then took another, longer strip and began to wrap it tightly around his torso, binding the makeshift dressing in place. Her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and taut with muscle. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. It was an act of profound intimacy, born of brutal necessity. She was tending to the man who had protected her, using the very fabric of her past to heal a wound he had received in her defense. When she was finished, she tied the knot securely. He was breathing heavily, his face slick with a sheen of sweat. He looked down at the rough bandage, then up at her. His stormy eyes, clouded with pain, held a new depth, a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He simply held her gaze, and in that look, 1,000 unsaid things passed between them. Later, after June had cried herself into an exhausted sleep, they sat by the fire. Jed had refused to lie down, insisting on sitting in his usual spot, a tin cup of coffee laced with whiskey in his hand. Ruth sat on the other stool, the silence between them as thick and warm as the wool blanket around her shoulders. The fire crackled. The only sound in the world. The storm had passed, leaving a strange, hollow peace in its wake. They had faced the worst and they had survived. It was June's small voice from the darkness that finally broke the spell. She wasn't asleep. She had been lying there, listening. "Are we family now?" The question was so simple, so innocent, so utterly profound. It hung in the fire-lit air, a fragile, hopeful thing. It was a child's attempt to put a name to the fierce, unspoken bonds that had been forged between them in blood and terror and loyalty. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She did not know how to answer. She looked at Jed. His face was cast in shadow, his expression unreadable. He did not look at the child. He did not offer an answer of his own. Instead, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head and looked directly at Ruth. His eyes asked his own question. He was leaving the answer to her. He, the man of action and silence, was making her the arbiter of their future. In his gaze, she saw the weight of his own broken past, his solitude, his hesitant hope. He was asking if she was willing to claim this broken, battered, beautiful thing they had built together. Ruth thought of her father's house, a place of cold transactions and betrayal. She thought of her flight, the endless days of running, of being alone, and she looked at the man before her, wounded and weary but unbowed, and the child sleeping in the corner, and the rough-hewn walls of this cabin that had become her sanctuary. This was not the life she had ever imagined, but it was a life she had fought for. It was a life she had chosen. She held Jed's gaze, and a slow, sure certainty bloomed in her chest. She gave a single, deliberate nod. Yes. A barely perceptible tension seemed to leave Jed's shoulders. He gave a nod of his own, a mirror of hers, a silent confirmation. The agreement was sealed. No vows were spoken, no promises made. There was only this shared, quiet understanding in the firelight. The next morning, Ruth woke to the familiar sounds of the homestead. Jed was already up, moving stiffly but resolutely, feeding the animals. The horrors of the previous day felt like a fever dream, but the dull ache in her muscles and the dark stain on the dirt outside were grim reminders. She built up the fire and put coffee on to boil. As she moved about the cabin, her hand went to her bodice, to the familiar weight of her mother's necklace. For weeks, it had been a secret talisman, a hidden link to her past and a symbol of what she was running from. She pulled it out, the intricate silver cool and heavy in her palm. She looked at it, really looked at it, for the first time without fear. It was not a curse, it was her history. It was a legacy of strength passed down through a line of women she had never known. But its journey, like hers, was over. She walked to the large stone hearth that dominated the cabin. Above the mantel, driven into the chinking between the logs, were a few sturdy wooden pegs where Jed hung pouches of herbs to dry, with a sense of quiet ceremony. She reached up and hung the necklace from one of the pegs. The silver gleamed in the morning light, the dark stone like a watchful eye. It was no longer hidden. It was a part of the home now, woven into the fabric of their lives. Just as she was, it was a statement, silent but absolute. She was no longer running. She had stopped. She was home. The first light of morning after the battle was different. It was the same cold, silver light that had always sliced through the cracks in the cabin walls. But today, it did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like a promise. The world outside the small window was washed clean, scrubbed by the violence of the previous day, and what remained was a stark, quiet beauty. Ruth was the first to stir. She moved from her small cot with a new kind of quietness, a sense of ownership, of belonging. Her body ached, a deep, resonant soreness from the tension and the unaccustomed recoil of the old Remington. But it was a good ache. It was the ache of survival, the physical proof that she had stood her ground. She looked across the small room. Jed was asleep in his cot, a rare sight. The ordeal and the wound in his side had finally forced his body to claim the rest his iron will had denied it. In sleep, his face lost some of its harshness. The lines around his eyes and mouth softened, revealing the weariness he so carefully concealed when he was awake. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm. On the mantel above the hearth, her mother's silver necklace caught the first rays of the sun, its dark stone seeming to absorb the light. A silent, watchful guardian. It was exactly where it belonged, June was still asleep, her small face peaceful, one hand clutching the little carved horse. Ruth gently pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders, her heart clenching with a love so fierce it was almost painful. This, she thought, this is what it feels like to have something to lose. Not a thing, not a piece of silver, but a life, 2 lives, intertwined with her own. Quietly, so as not to wake them, she slipped outside. The air was crisp and cold, and she hugged her arms to her chest. The ground was scarred. The dark stain near the water trough, the scuffed earth where men had fallen. She refused to look at it. She turned her face toward the mountains, toward the new day. The world was still. The only sound was the soft nicker of a horse from the corral and the distant cry of a hawk. She went about her morning chores, her movements imbued with a new sense of purpose. She drew water from the well, the rhythmic creak of the pulley a familiar, comforting sound. She scattered grain for the few chickens, who came running, their clucking a cheerful, mundane sound that was a balm to her soul. She was not just performing tasks, she was tending to the sinews of her home. It was by the fence line of the small vegetable garden, the one she had painstakingly weeded and watered for weeks, that she saw it. Clinging to the rough, weathered wood of a fence post was a single, defiant flower. It was a small thing, no bigger than a silver dollar, with petals the color of a faded purple sunset, a desert verbena, perhaps. It had no business being there, blooming in the hard, unforgiving soil, surrounded by dust and thorns. It was a small, impossible miracle of color and life. In her old life, she would not have noticed it. Her eyes had always been cast downward, watching for trouble, avoiding notice. And in the first weeks here, she had been too consumed with survival to see anything beyond the next task. But this morning, her eyes were open. She reached out and gently touched one of the delicate petals. It was soft, almost velvety, yet it held a strength that allowed it to exist in this harsh world. It was, she thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. On pure impulse, without a second thought, she carefully plucked it, its thin stem cool in her fingers. She held it for a moment, this small, perfect piece of beauty. She didn't know what to do with it. It felt wrong to simply let it wilt in her hand, and taking it inside the dark cabin seemed like a betrayal of its sun-born vibrancy. Then she thought of Jed. She thought of his silence, his strength, the terrible torment in his eyes when he had knelt in the dust. She thought of how he had given her a choice, a gun, a home. She had no words to thank him for any of it. Words were clumsy, inadequate things, and they were not the language of this place, or of this man. She walked to the front of the cabin, to the small, covered stoop. Beside the door sat an old, scarred ammunition box. It was where Jed sat every evening, after the work was done, to smoke his pipe and watch the last of the light fade from the sky. It was his space, a place of quiet contemplation. The box itself was a symbol of his world hard, practical, scarred by use, and filled with the potential for violence. With a heart that beat a little faster, she leaned down and placed the small purple flower directly in the center of the crate's lid. The contrast was stark, the delicate, living splash of color against the dark, weathered wood. It was a tiny, fragile offering, a whisper of softness in a world of hard edges. It was a gesture so small it was almost meaningless, yet it felt to her like the bravest thing she had ever done, second only to pulling the trigger of the Remington. She did not wait to see if he would notice. She turned and went back to her chores, her cheeks burning. The day unfolded. Jed woke, moving stiffly, his face pale but his will unbroken. He drank the coffee she had ready for him without a word, his eyes acknowledging her presence with a quiet intensity. He saw the necklace on the mantel. His gaze rested on it for a long moment. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a landmark that had always been there. He spent the morning repairing the back door Coley had kicked in. his movements slow and deliberate. Ruth took June out to the corral, keeping the child occupied, her cheerful chatter a necessary antidote to the lingering shadows of the previous day. All morning, Ruth was acutely aware of the front of the cabin. She resisted the urge to look, to see if the flower was still there. She was terrified that he would have brushed it aside, dismissed it as a piece of foolishness, a weed cluttering his space. The uncertainty was a tight knot in her stomach. At midday, they ate their meal of beans and cornbread in the usual silence. When Jed finished, he rose and walked out to the stoop. Ruth held her breath. She watched through the open door as he lowered himself carefully onto the ammunition box. He saw the flower. She saw his gaze fall upon it. He did not move for a full minute. He simply looked at it. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his pipe and tobacco pouch, and began his ritual, his movements careful not to disturb the small bloom. He sat there for a long time, smoking in the warm sun, a silent guardian with a single purple flower at his side. The knot in Ruth's stomach did not dissolve. It transformed into something warm and hopeful. The afternoon passed. The sun began its descent once more, and the air grew cool. The rhythms of the evening chores took over, a familiar, comforting cadence. After their simple supper, a fire was lit in the hearth, chasing the shadows into the corners of the room. The cabin was filled with a warm, flickering light. June, exhausted from the day, was already nodding off on her cot. Jed sat at the rough-hewn table, a lantern at his elbow. He had a large, leather-bound book open in front of him. It was his ledger, the place where he kept the accounts of his solitary life, the price of salt and flour, the number of hides he had traded, the dates he had planted his garden. It was the written record of his survival, penned in a stark, practical hand. "She needs another blanket," Ruth said softly, her voice startling in the quiet room. "The nights are getting colder." Jed looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He nodded toward a high shelf where the spare blankets were kept. As Ruth walked past the table to fetch one, she glanced down at the open ledger. She couldn't help it. Her eyes were drawn to the page. It was filled with columns of numbers and spare, masculine script. And there, lying carefully in the center of the right-hand page, was the small purple wildflower. He was pressing it. He had taken her small, fragile offering and was preserving it within the pages of his life's record. He was making it a permanent part of his story. It was tucked between a notation about the cost of rifle cartridges and a reminder to repair the corral fence. Beauty and hope, pressed right between the hard facts of violence and labor. She stopped, her hand frozen in midair as she reached for the blanket. She stared at the flower, a lump forming in her throat. He knew she was looking. He didn't close the book or try to hide it. He simply sat there, his large, calloused hands resting on either side of the open ledger, as if presenting it for her inspection. Slowly, she raised her eyes from the book to his face, their gazes locked across the warm, flickering light of the lantern. And in that moment, she saw the change. It was a profound and fundamental shift, a sea change in the depths of his stormy eyes. The wariness was gone. The silence was no longer a wall he built around himself, a defense against the world and the trouble it brought. This new silence was different. It was a presence. It was the quiet, watchful stillness of a man standing guard. The hardness was still there. The capability for violence had not vanished, but it was no longer pointed inward, a shield against her. It was now directed outward, a bulwark against the world. With her and June safely inside its perimeter, it was the steady, unwavering presence of a protector who had finally and completely accepted what he was protecting. It was the silence of a man who had found something worth guarding with his life, and had found it to be a small, purple wildflower offered by a woman with haunted eyes. No one spoke. No words were needed. The ledger, with its impossible bloom, said everything. A slow tear escaped Ruth's eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. She took a deep, steadying breath, a breath that felt like the first clean breath of her life, and a small, true smile touched her lips. She turned, took the heavy wool blanket from the shelf, and carried it over to June, tucking it gently around the sleeping child. The gesture was no longer just a chore, it was a benediction. The days that followed were built of a new kind of silence. The heavy, watchful quiet of before had been replaced by a silence that was soft and breathable, like a well-worn blanket. The ghosts had been exorcised by the roar of a gun, and what was left was the solid, reassuring presence of the living. Jed's wound healed slowly. Ruth cleaned and rebandaged it each morning, a ritual of quiet intimacy that became a cornerstone of their new reality. Her touch was gentle but sure, and he accepted her care with a stillness that was a form of trust more profound than any spoken words. He never winced, never complained, but she would see a flicker of pain in the depths of his stormy eyes, and her heart would ache with a tenderness that was both new and terrifying. Life settled into the deep, comfortable grooves of routine. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a choreography learned not through practice, but through a deep, instinctual knowledge of one another. She would have a cup of coffee ready for him before he knew he wanted it. He would bring in a full bucket of water just as she was about to find the other one empty. They were two halves of a whole, a single functioning unit against the vast indifference of the land. June was the heart of that unit. The terror of the ambush had faded from her eyes, replaced by a new, quiet confidence. She chattered and played as before, but she stayed closer now. Her small orbit centered around the twin sons of Ruth and Jed. She would take Ruth's hand while they walked to the garden, and in the evenings, she would sit on the floor and lean her small back against Jed's leg as he smoked his pipe. She was the thread that wove their disparate lives into a single, strong tapestry. The memory of the violence was a scar on the land and on their souls, but like all scars, it was a testament to healing, a proof of survival. The homestead was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress they had held together. The feeling of being hunted had vanished from Ruth's bones, replaced by the steady, deep-rooted feeling of being home. One evening, about a week after the fight, the sky put on a spectacle. The sun sank below the distant mountains in a riot of color, painting the clouds in impossible shades of fiery orange, deep rose and bruised purple. The light spilled across the valley, turning the dust to gold and the harsh lines of the landscape to soft, gentle curves. It was a beautiful, heartbreakingly peaceful sight. Jed was in his accustomed spot on the stoop, sitting on the old ammunition box, his pipe sending a thin curl of blue smoke into the still air. He was watching the sky, his face unreadable, but Ruth could see the tension had gone from his shoulders. He was at peace in his own domain. Ruth came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been watching him through the open door, and a powerful, undeniable impulse had pulled her outside. She walked over and stood beside him, not sitting, but standing, her shoulder almost brushing his. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming emotion of the moment. They stood in silence for a long time, two solitary figures watching the day die, their shared shadow stretching long and deep behind them. She thought back to the first time she had seen him, a fearsome, unmovable giant in the dark of a freight car. She thought of her own desperate whisper, a gamble thrown into the void. She thought of the shelter of his coat, the first kindness she had known in what felt like a lifetime. So much had changed. She had changed. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft, but it carried in the quiet air, clear and steady. "I used to ask you to hide me under your duster." He turned his head slowly to look at her. The last of the sun's light caught his face, illuminating the stark lines of his jaw and the deep, stormy gray of his eyes. He did not speak. He did not cut her off or prompt her to continue. He simply looked at her, his gaze direct and patient, giving her the full, undivided weight of his attention. He was listening, not just with his ears, but with his entire being. She drew a deep breath, the clean, sage-scented air filling her lungs. She turned her head to meet his gaze, and she did not look away. "Now," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet, certain strength, "I just want to stand beside you. No duster, no more hiding." It was everything. It was a confession, a declaration, and a vow. It was the closing of a circle that had begun in darkness and desperation. She was no longer the frightened girl looking for a shadow to disappear into. She was a woman who had found her place in the light, and that place was next to him. She was not asking for his protection anymore. She was offering her presence. She was claiming her space, her life, her future at his side. The silence that followed was absolute. The world seemed to hold its breath. The crickets had not yet started their evening song. The wind was still. Jed's gaze never wavered from her face. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a storm of emotions too deep and complex for a man like him to ever put into words. She saw the memory of the train, the echo of the gunshots, the image of a wildflower pressed in a book. He was seeing her, not as the runaway he had sheltered, but as the woman who had fought beside him, who had healed him, who was now offering him the one thing he had never had: a partner. He raised his hand. For a terrifying second, she thought he might just touch her shoulder, a simple gesture of acknowledgement before turning back to his solitude. But he didn't. His large, calloused hand, scarred from a life of hard labor and harder fights, reached for her own. Slowly, deliberately, he took her hand. His fingers closed around hers, engulfing her smaller hand in a grip that was not forceful, but was as firm and unshakable as the mountains behind them. The shock of his touch was electric. His skin was rough, but his hand was warm, and a current of life, of strength, of profound, unspoken tenderness flowed from him into her. It was the first time he had ever touched her with anything other than practical necessity or detached comfort. This was different. This was a choice. This was an answer. He did not say a word. He didn't have to. The simple, solid weight of his hand in hers was a more eloquent vow than any preacher could ever hope to witness. It said, "You are not alone. I am here. This is our place." He gave her hand a gentle, almost imperceptible squeeze. And then he stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He did not release her hand. He kept it firmly in his own as he stepped down from the stoop, leading her into the yard. A few feet away, in the middle of the dusty, golden space, June was playing with Buck. She was throwing a small, knotted piece of rope, and the old dog, with a newfound burst of energy, was gamely trotting after it, his one floppy ear bouncing. The child's laughter pealed through the twilight, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. She looked up and saw them, hand in hand, and a wide, gap-toothed grin split her face. They stopped, standing together in the center of the world they had built, the world they had defended. The three of them, a broken man, a runaway woman, and an orphaned child. They were an impossible, accidental family, forged in the crucible of the merciless West. Above them, the sky was a breathtaking canvas of deep purple and the first, faint pinpricks of silver stars. The wind stirred, a cool, gentle breath that whispered through the sparse grass and tugged at Ruth's hair. Jed's hand was a warm, solid anchor in the vast, gathering darkness. They stood there for a long time, watching the child play, their hands clasped together, a silent, unshakable promise passing between them under the vast, wild, and beautiful sky. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect and hear your thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video. And consider giving it an extra boost by hitting the hype button to help more people discover this tale.